Hey there, welcome to Have You Asked Your Dad? This is the podcast where we ask dads questions that they don't normally get asked. And today we are asking the question, what was it like when you first became a dad? What did you feel? What did you experience? What did you go through for those first few days, weeks, and months when your child first arrived, when you met that person for the first time? The reason why we're asking this question is because we've had two special birthdays over this last week. My son Liam turned 9 and Sean's daughter Zoe turned 7. And when it is your child's birthday, you can't help but think back to those earliest moments when you first became a parent. But since this is a very big topic and a very big conversation, we decided to split it up across 3 episodes. So this first episode is going to be about Zoe and Sean. The second episode will be about Eli and Terrence. And the third episode will be about Liam and Terrence. So every kid will get their own episode as we talk about what it was like meeting them and bringing them into the family and all of those big emotions and feelings and experiences that happen when a child first arrives. So let's get right into it. This is Sean and my conversation about when Zoe arrived. Lieutenant Corporal Lutz. I'm not even sure if that's a real...
I'm sitting here in a t-shirt and shorts. I cannot live up to that title, at least not today. Maybe if I were wearing at least a collared shirt. No epaulets.
That's the minimum.
Yeah, sorry about that. Sorry about that.
I do suddenly realize that we are recording this as a video, and I'm like, oh my word, I generally don't wear glasses for public appearances. And if I wear glasses,
confused, yes,
they most confused, right?
Yeah, most certainly would.
Yeah,
exactly. How do we tell the difference between the two of them?
How are you, sir?
I'm good, thank you. There's been a birthday in our house recently,
yes.
So the festivities that come with birthday celebrations, and much the same in yours, right?
That's right. Liam, my eldest, turned 9 last week, and I can't believe I'm the father of a 9-year-old. That feels crazy to me. And so,
congratulations,
yeah,
well done.
And Zoe turned 7 on Saturday.
Yes, she did. And as I said, congratulations to you. I was thinking how many people congratulated us on her birthday. And I wondered, in reflecting, whether that was the same for my parents. Did people often say congratulations on my birthday? And does that come with as much weight? Because now when I think about if my parents were congratulated on my birthday, maybe when I was very young, but as you get older, is that like a, well done, you kept him alive? Well done, you've survived. Well done, he's finally out the house. Congratulations, you must be so happy. I'm not quite sure where that congratulatory message is supposed to land when someone outside of the family congratulates you on your child's birth. But nonetheless,
I think it should be all of those things. Congratulations that that your child has got through another year. Congratulations that you survived and that you got your child through another year. Considering that we do all the work, I don't see why the child is getting it's a whole new perspective on birthdays when you become a parent. But this is where your idea of us really talking through our early experiences of our children, really, and having a conversation around that, because this is something that dads don't get asked. What was your first experiences with your child like? And so we're going to be trying to kind of pull apart those first few months with Zoe and Liam and Eli, or Zoe, Eli, and Liam, because we're going to go from youngest to oldest over the next couple of episodes, which means I get to talk to you about my favorite Kales River girl, Zoe.
Somebody over the weekend referred to her as a golden girl. And I know it was very much like, there's lots of good things in your future, but that those two words next to one another don't elicit anything other than the Golden Girls TV show, like a retirement village and getting up to nonsense.
I didn't think
That's the first place my brain goes. Yeah. Nonetheless, the Golden Girl, yep.
Truly a child of the 80s.
I must say the idea for the episodes came about because Rwanda and I tend to do a fair amount of reflection around Zoe's birth date, right? Where were we? What were we doing? So it's the type of conversations that comes up every year. And surprisingly, there's always something that we had either forgotten or either the conversation maybe dissipated and we didn't quite get to all of the things. But it made me wonder about other people's experiences around their child's birth, and if they too reflect on how far they've come and what they experienced at the time. So I'm looking forward to learning more about how your fathering journey began. I'm not going to lie. Um, but yeah, let's start talking about Zoe and her entry into the world.
So we're not going to go to the very beginning because that's between you and your wife. But
Thank you.
let's jump 9 months, or at least almost 9 months ahead in the story, and we know that Zoe was born under quite difficult circumstances. What I actually realized I didn't know going into this episode was, did you know that there was going to be issues beforehand? Were there tests that you had done that was like, wait a second, we might be encountering some problems?
Yes, the short answer is yes. So you're quite right. 9 months of pregnancy, but probably about 6 or 7 months in. I'm trying to remember which scan it was. What do they call it? Like the 20 odd week scan, 21, somewhere there, where they do a 4D, which I thought sounded like the coolest thing ever. Wow, 4D, that's amazing. And it was at that scan that, we were read this laundry list of things that they anticipated for Zoe. And it was in that meeting that we were told to make a decision by Monday whether or not we were going to abort. She'd even said to
Wow.
us, we've left it so late that if we don't do it soon, we're going to run into other problems. I suppose
Ooh.
that meant legal wise. So that was the start of a lot of trauma, right? And the child's not even here yet. Um, and that laundry list, Terence, at the time, it was a hurried blood. It was a blood test that had been done, and the gynae had phoned to say that they're picking up the possibility of something like spina bifida, and they're not 100% sure. And what can we? Where are we? And we're like, well, we're going for the 4 week scan in a week's time. Like, it's just it's booked. It's there. And it was then at that scan, and I will never forget this, lying in that doctor's office, hoping she's going to say, don't worry, things have moved along. You're cool. We can leave. And as she lifted that little sonar device off Rue's tummy, without even offering her a towel to clean up, all that jelly gel stuff,
Mm.
Rue hadn't even sat up on the bed, and I was still sort of hunched in the corner, sitting on a chair because the space is so small. She basically launched into this laundry list, as I've said, of things that she's spotted that she feels are wrong with our child. Everything from the blood flow in her brain, to the size of her chin, to holes in her heart, to, she said, don't worry about the spina bifida, that you didn't have to worry about. But,
All of these
then
other
followed it up with
things.
all sorts of other things, and proceeded to tell us about invasive surgeries that they could do, that might put the child and mom at risk. They can't quite tell what's going on inside her head. Her head's enlarged, this, that, and the other. And that started the roller coaster ride, I suppose, of where we are now, 7 years later. So to answer your question, yes, we knew there was something, but we didn't know to what extent that something would be. And to fast forward a little bit, that scan was the Friday. By the Monday, we had organized to at least have some form of second opinion. And by the Monday, that scan with a different doctor revealed at least 3 of the things on the list were no longer, major concerns. Either it was something along the lines of the blood flow had stemmed, I think, sort of slowed down as opposed to being really fast through the brain. And there were a few other things that he said, well, don't have to worry about that. A small chin doesn't necessarily indicate one way or the other. Could just mean she has a small chin, like looking at both parents. And so a little bit more cognizant of the information in front of him in terms of what the parents look like and what the parents are,
Mm.
in living, breathing flesh, and not just an analytical study on what the scan says, and only going on that data. Uh, and then it led to,
Being a human being about that moment, really.
which was lovely. It was it was a refreshing take on, the previous experience. And that basically set us on a course of seeing the same specialist probably once a month, maybe twice, closer to the end. And when I say end, I mean, the beginning, the birth.
So I just want to quickly go back to that moment, at that 6 month scan when like you're saying, you were describing it so deeply of, your wife's still literally on the bed, still covered in, her stomach's still covered in jelly. You're crouched in the corner. The word you said was roller coaster. It started that's the beginning of the roller coaster ride. And I know from my experience of getting very intense and hectic news like that, I can feel the blood draining away from my head, and I literally get a sense of vertigo. I feel like I'm on a physical roller coaster. And I was wondering about what your physical expression of that moment was like. What was your body feeling as you're receiving this news?
Nothing.
Wow.
Absolutely nothing. I think I was most likely holding this facade of stability and being somewhat a pillar of strength, I suppose, would be the cliche. Um, Trying to take in as much of the information as possible, but at the same time, I was very concerned for Rue because, like I described, she barely even sat up. We hadn't really had a chance to just compose yourself before launching into all of this news. So I was most concerned for her and how she was receiving all of this. I think through the entire process, I was very aware of everything is happening to her body, and she's experiencing things at a mile a minute. From kicking to being uncomfortable to not being able to sleep to feeling nauseous or whatever the case might be. I was very aware that none of that was happening to me. So my emotions, my feelings, my mental state was very secondary. It was not front and center at all. And it's funny that you say that because I think it was either that afternoon or the following afternoon. I remember it was cold and rainy and so forth. And at one point over the weekend, I remember we lit a fire in the fireplace. And I do remember bawling my eyes out then.
Mm.
But I think that was probably the only occasion for the majority of time that I actually released any form of emotion. There's been plenty of times since. I'm not afraid of crying. I think it's really good. Sometimes I need a little bit of help. So that's when This Is Us comes in very handy. Um, so, yeah, I think that kind of sums up where I was at mentally.
I mean, that really is a bigger version, I think, of what a lot of dads go through when it comes to their first or any of their children. Really, is that there's this kind of complex web of knowing that whatever you're experiencing, your partner is experiencing 10,000 times more, because, like you say, it's her body. Even if there are no problems or challenges, you're still very aware that whatever the tough part, that the tough emotion, the tough physical part of it, your partner's going through that even more. And so it can be hard to give yourself any space to deal with your own stuff. And I do wonder how many men don't even have that moment that you had later in the day when you're around the fire and finally you have a chance to emote and process. I think and we'll get to my story in the next couple of episodes, but I can totally see how it goes from I need to be here for my wife to using that as a crutch to not actually deal for your own emotions. I'm just going to focus on these two other people now who are much more important than me, and I'm not going to deal with my stuff at all. So I can imagine that there must have been a very complex moment for you to figure out when to allow yourself to cry, to hurt, to be angry, to scream into the void or whatever you felt like you needed to do, while also knowing that your partner's going through the same thing and potentially a lot more. That must have been a difficult process. But then you go through this, you go through all of your second opinions, you go through all of the tests, like you were saying. Then the day of birth arrives. Was that a planned birth?
Oh, we are people of the earth, Terrence. We had thought it was going to be everything would be a natural process. We're going to do this as smooth as possible. This is prior to the scan,
Sure.
obviously.
There'll be trees, there'll be, nature's involved.
I mean, we were never going to do a home birth. It was never going to be outside, but it was always going to be as close to natural as possible.
Sure.
And Rue was adamant to find herself a gynae that was going to do a natural birth, and she wasn't going to immediately say, let's book you in for a C-section on the 12th of, because, that suits my schedule, whatever.
My golf time.
Yeah. So that was always the plan. And she'd gotten a doula involved from the very beginning. It was a very physical, mental process. A combination of body and mind going through this entire process. We stuck through with the doula process right up until the end. So we didn't, sort of let that go because we knew that everything's going to be completely different. And Dagani was also very happy for us to carry as long as possible. There was always the concern that it might be a little bit premature, but that wasn't the case. So without revealing too many details, she carried full term. And a very interesting process is that she'd gone into labor, I think, on the Monday, right? Like water break situations. But by Wednesday, Zoe still wasn't here. And when we finally made the decision on Wednesday to do a C-section, which of course then is determined as an emergency C-section because it wasn't planned, it's like then Zoe basically just calmed down. It was very interesting, from the kicking to the trying to induce to all of those things. It's almost like mind and body were so connected that when we decided, okay, it's enough now, we've tried hard enough, we're now going to a bit too far. She's a good weight, she's all of those things. If we really try and push her here, we might upset her far more than is necessary. So it was very interesting for me to note that the Wednesday we had decided, okay, you know what, let's not force this anymore. Let's just go the C-section route. And it was almost within an hour thereafter, everybody just calmed down and Zoe just rested until the next morning. So that was interesting. And then, yes, C-section, knowing that there were complications, but nobody really fully understanding what those complications were going to be, because we had obviously opted not to do any form of invasive surgery to try and operate on her brain or do anything prior. At that point, they thought there might be we might need to put a stent in. There might be a blockage of fluid. There might be. So we went with the birthing process, and in that, I now know that there was some fluid that Zoe had taken in, and that caused complications with her breathing. But that wasn't the first thing everybody thought. Most people thought, well, there's a problem. We know there's a problem with her brain, and she's not breathing properly, so it's probably a brain thing. So immediately, this 4.5 kg kid, roughly, was in the NICU with 500-gram kids on sort of ventilator type machines and all that sort of thing, trying to dry out her lungs and get her to breathe, and CPAP machines, basically keeping her alive. But once they had gotten rid of all of that fluid and so forth, she was in NICU for about 12 days, I think, until they'd managed to stabilize her. And in that process, we'd run blood tests, we'd run scans. We didn't do anything invasive. And they said, you know what, she's got a big head. It looks like she has a big brain inside that head. We can't tell where or how, if anything else is affected. So the pediatrician suggested that we just carry on and see how things develop. We know that there's something, we just don't know what that something is and when it will start to show up. So he's like, treat her as you would treat a normal kid, but just don't pass her around to too many people. Don't bring her in contact with people that smoke a lot, all of those types of things, because obviously she's got sensitivities. And let's see how things go.
So I want to, it's so interesting because, we're focusing on your experience of this time, and in that wonderful description of the first few weeks, you haven't mentioned yourself once. And I think this is the thing with dads, right? This is the thing that we do. The kind of dads that we want to be are caring, we want to be other person centered, we want to be servant hearted for our families, and that means putting everyone but ourselves first, which is not something I'm arguing against. But even when there's a moment when it's appropriate to talk about your own feelings, it is hard for people like you and me to do that translation, which is why you have a friend like me asking these questions, because one of the things you mentioned... Probe away. You're talking about, you've made that decision now that the C-section is going to happen, and everyone calms down. When you say that, does that include yourself? Did you also get a sense of calm when those decisions were made, or were you just happy that everyone else was calm?
Probably the latter. I don't remember it being something that switched for me, but it would have been a switch because I could see everybody else that, we'd come around a table. We've got a gynae, we've got nurses, we've got a doula, we've got Rwanda, we've got me. There are lots of things to consider. I always definitely felt like the last thing that needed to be considered.
Yeah.
Right? My opinion is the one that holds the least amount of weight when you've got the doctors and the professionals that have done this far more. Plus, there's somebody in there whose body is actually under stress and strain. My opinion on the matter is not important. My priority is to keep my wife as calm and as present as I possibly can without her experiencing pain or additional stress. I mean, she's a smart person. Let's not kid ourselves. She's an exceptionally smart cookie, that one.
And she still married you. So, there's...
I know. I must have done something
There must have been
right?
There must have been something.
Something.
Yeah.
So, no, I don't remember at any point going, whew, now I feel better. It would definitely have been a knock-on effect. Okay, they're all comfortable. That makes me feel more comfortable.
And then the birth happens. Zoe goes into NICU for 12 days. I've never experienced NICU for any period of time, but I've had friends who've had children for weeks and weeks in NICU, and it is incredibly tough to, even if it's, even before COVID times, it's still hard to not have your child at home with you and having to go to another place to visit. In that process, was Zoe staying at the hospital? Were both you coming home? Not Zoe, Rue, sorry, rather. How was that working out? And how much time were you able to spend with your daughter in those first few days? Also, I know at that time, you didn't have a lot of leave time from work, so you're rushing back and forth to work as well. So how did you cope with that first 2 weeks of daughter in NICU, work, wife recovering?
I don't know. The fact that I'm here is, I don't know. I can recall that, again, Rwanda, as resilient as she is, refused for the evening to set without having seen her daughter, because that's basically what we were looking at. C-section was around 8 o'clock in the morning. Or at least it's early. So Zoe's been in NICU for hours, and Rue's now obviously recovering from a C-section, which involves medication to keep you, to manage the pain. And I could tell stories about how she had let that slip. I'm not sure if you're aware, but they give you sort of a morphine drip thing, which you can control, right?
Yeah.
And she was told to stay ahead of the pain, but she didn't know what the pain was until she realized she didn't stay ahead of the pain. And then she set alarms on her cell phone to remind herself to give herself the medication or whatever the interval was. Which left me in a spot where I had a wife that was in and out because she was, not to say that she was hallucinating, but that's the feeling I got. I got very much like, I don't have anybody now. I have a child that's on a CPAP machine struggling to breathe in one room, and I have a wife lying in a bed highly medicated in the other room, and I am literally going from the one to the other to check on who is got their eyes open, or who can I have a conversation with, or, I mean, you're quite right. NICU is an environment that's very quiet, that everybody works precisely because you're working with children that are in high stress situations. If they're not in an incubator, they're there because they need to be monitored. So they're one-on-one sort of attention. And if there's a mom in there with their child, you don't want to disturb that mom or the nurse. So it's not an environment that allows for you to express yourself at all. I didn't have anybody to express myself at or with either. So balancing just that one day, again, I do recall on that one day when it got to the end of the day and my wife was still so insistent. I remember her telling the nurse that I will see my daughter. And the nurse said, no, you need to lie here for at least a day or two while you recover. And she said, there's no ways I'm lying here. By hell or high water, I will either drag my bloody body, these are the words, from here to the NICU, but I will see, or you bring me a wheelchair, but I will see my daughter today.
I can 100% hear Rue saying those exact words. I can tell.
Yes.
But what did that make you? What were you hoping your wife would say? at that point? Because again, you're right. Her body, she's gone through this whole thing. She has complete and utter right to have control over what happens there. But as her partner, as the mother of your child, what were you hoping or feeling about your wife at that moment?
I needed desperately for her to see Zoe so that she herself could calm in some way and go, okay,
Right.
things are under control. I can't move Zoe because she's hooked up to machines, so she can't go anywhere. And I also I'm supporting my wife, obviously. How do I get her from this room to that room? Fortunately, it was a single passage. There wasn't a lot of space, but if you've got any form of operation, and in this case, I mean, this is an intense operation. You can't just get up and go there. I will say, though, that Rue did go and see Zoe by the end of the evening. She was in a wheelchair. They pushed her around to get involved. And there was no, I think the most we could do was touch her hand, really, because we also weren't really allowed to pick Zoe up. So all of those things about first contact and skin to skin and all of that beautiful stuff were sold in the media did not happen. And that in itself is heartbreaking, right? His mom has looked forward to being able to do that.
And you're looking forward to seeing that happen. You're looking forward to that wonderful, warm moment of like,
Precisely.
This is my family moment. And
let's take a photograph.
Yes.
But no, that didn't really happen. And I do distinctly remember at some point, I'm sure it was probably after 8-9 o'clock at night, because I can't stay. I have to get out. She can still stay because mom privileges.
Yeah.
I remember sitting on the floor in the passage between the two rooms. And I mean, I was exhausted, obviously. So there's nobody would look at me like going, "Oh, what are you doing on the floor?" And I knew that nobody would judge that. So I just tucked my head onto my knees and I rested my head on my knees. And that's where I had my cry of the day. I was like, I can't, I'm exhausted. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to help. I don't know where to be. I don't know who needs me more. I can't do anything for either of them. All I can do is advocate, and my voice against any of the others, doctors, nurses, is really not strong enough. So that was a waiting game for me. And that was how I left the hospital on that fateful Thursday evening.
So just feeling kind of powerless and helpless.
Yeah. And looking forward to getting back in the car and coming back again bright and early the next morning, because that's all I can do.
And again, we get sold this image of fatherhood as being like the man with the plan, the person who, makes sure his family is safe and comfortable and has ticked all these boxes. And when you're not able to do that, either through your own powerlessness or the situation being just, in your case, just so catastrophically huge, I wonder if there is also a thing of just how we're socialized, that we don't know how to be weak and how to be powerless and how to just be in a situation where we are powerless. So when that happens, it's devastating.
Yeah.
So we're running out of time and obviously the story doesn't end with the birth of Zoe. It continues for at minimum 6 years. And we could probably write a whole novel we could write several tomes about your experiences as a father. But she's in, I think this is probably where we should probably end, but she's in NICU for 12 days. She's finally released. Released sounds like she's in prison. Yep. She's finally healthy enough to come home. Discharged. Yes. Talk to me about, and I really want you to, this is going to be your challenge. Focus on what you were experiencing, putting your daughter in the car, getting your daughter home, getting her in her room, getting her all of those things, because again, your story is a lot more complex than the average person's story of getting their child home for the first time. I'm assuming.
I would assume the same. I mean, I don't know what other people's stories are, but I would assume similarly. Yeah. I think the thing I was feeling, if I do my very best to cast my mind back there, because so much of it is a blur, and this is why we probably relive around her birthdays and try and reflect and try and recall some of these things. I think the overarching feeling was vulnerability. And I pinned that mostly on a very clear memory of when I tried to bathe her the first time in our own home. Jeepers, I know I said at the beginning of this I don't cry very often, but I cried then too. So maybe that's why the emotions, the memories are so strong,
Yeah.
because they were strong
I mean, look,
emotions.
you've only mentioned crying 3 times across the period of like 6 months, which for me, for what you've gone through, is about 10% of what would be reasonable to expect.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
so
That is probably when it dried up for a while. Yeah. So I think the overarching feeling would be that of vulnerability. It was to, to put her in her own bed, but I don't trust that I can leave her there for any particular month. She's been connected to machines that tell me what her heart rate is, what her heart rate is at, and how much oxygen she's getting through, like what her oxygen levels are like. She's had those little probes on her fingers. She's had the heat over her head. She's had monitored feeding. She's been, all of that's been taken care of professionals for 12 days. And I'm not one of those, right? This is brand new. And now you're trusted. They say, no, she can go home now. And you really want to go, but are you sure?
yeah, are you coming with
Don't
us?
one of you want to come with?
Yeah.
Yeah, precisely. The level of care she's had here is far better than she can have at home. So I think maybe she should just stay for a little bit longer. So everything, I'm sure many parents can attest to putting your child into the car seat in your car and driving home and feeling like everybody drives like a maniac.
Yes.
Right? Don't brake so hard. The lights are red. Can you indicate? Why are we turning? All of those things. So from a sensory input situation, I remember that quite vividly. And feeding was something that obviously I wasn't involved in any way, shape, or form initially. So the things that I remember were very much going, can I actually walk away? Is it okay to leave her in a bed, swaddled, held? Was the most comfortable. If she was in my arms, then I felt at ease, because I knew where she was. I knew she was held, comfortable, all of that, comforted. And that's probably how I would say the first few days of getting her home sort of transpired.
And at what point did you start to feel like that vulnerability edged away, or did that vulnerability ever leave?
No, it hasn't left.
Okay.
No. I mean, you've probably heard about people talk about how, seeing their child is like having your heart outside of your body. Like, there goes a piece of your heart.
Yeah.
That's definitely it.
Yeah.
Definitely. I can echo that. But I feel vulnerable because of all the things that can still potentially happen at the drop of a hat, and that can spiral into a multitude of things. And I know every parent feels that same, there's a possibility that my child's going to fall out of a tree and break their arm, or there's a possibility that they're going to draw on the walls and I'm going to be angry. All of those possibilities. And that still exists for everybody. For me, it's a sense that there's a health issue here. There's a medical issue that people are constantly looking to find the answer for. Why did this happen? And what does it mean for her future, for your future, for everything? And because nobody can really give you a sense of what that's going to be, I will always be vulnerable to any additional inputs. And just as things start to stabilize, another doctor will say, oh, by the way, because Zoe has done X, Y, or Z, this is probably going to mean that in 3, 4, 5 years' time, P, Q, R, and T. So I never really feel like I have a sense. There's constantly somebody changing and pulling the rug out from underneath you. You feel stable, and then either she has a seizure and she ends up in hospital, or a multitude of things can happen.
I mean, the image I get in my head while you're talking is of a tightrope walker in a gusty walk, doing it across 2 buildings, and there's just gusts of wind. And every time you kind of get your balance, there's another gust of wind. And you get your balance again, and then there's another gust of wind in the other direction. And that's fine if you're doing a tightrope walk for 30 minutes. It's a little bit harder if it's for 6, 8, 10, 30, 40 years, as long
Yep.
as Zoe, and as long as you're going to be around, I guess. Um, and and that feeling of never, again, that you are right, all parents feel a level of vulnerability, but that tends to fade away as your child develops, as you see that your child is capable of doing certain things. Whereas for you, the kind of opposite keeps happening. As you're saying, you keep getting these real inputs that there's more vulnerabilities that start to arrive. How, and I mean this with all of as much respect as I can muster, so please hear it from where it's coming from. It's coming from as someone who's your friend, who cares about you. How are you not crying every day? How are you not angry? How are you, do you know what I'm saying? How are you not even just because of the vulnerability, how are you just not overcome with the emotion of having to deal with all of this all the time when other people don't?
Drugs and alcohol. No,
That's why you're so happy at 10 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah, as I sit here now, I am not on any medication, and I've had 1.5 cups of coffee, and that's the only drug.
Sure.
Sugar. Maybe there hasn't even been sugar. But no, I suppose getting to this point has been a lot of deep work, Terence. There have been the drugs. Don't get me wrong. When I saw my psychologist, we were on, and it wasn't even a lot of different ones. I've heard all sorts of stories about combinations and getting levels right, and all sorts of. I've managed to get myself off of those additional stimulants or help, and I needed the help. Let's not kid ourselves. I needed something to help to get me stable enough so that I could figure out where I fit into this picture again.
And you needed professional.
And I would recommend them.
You needed a professional help as well. It's not just that you can have a beer with your chummy and you feel better. You needed real support.
Yeah. No, my burnout was, looking back, as a result of the pressures of balancing work, i.e. that brings in money, and homework, i.e. that keeps my child safe and healthy and balanced and all of those things. So it was just work 24/7 and rushing from the one to the other and maintaining some form of accountability to both parties all the time. I lost my personality. I was definitely more weepy. I had withdrawn entirely. I wasn't interested in anything, nothing. I didn't want to listen to music. I didn't want to exercise. I didn't want to eat. I couldn't sleep. Trying to sleep was the worst thing because, I'm trying to sleep was almost worse than just lying there and realizing that you're not going to sleep. And to the point of the vulnerability thing, Zoe's case, yes, she's diagnosed with epilepsy and she's diagnosed with developmental delays, and they call it global developmental delays, which to my mind basically says anything that you think there's some form of a milestone on is going to be delayed. So that might be eating with a teaspoon, that might be walking, that might be digesting certain foods, that might be the cognitive ability to speak or to tell the difference between colors or to close your hand and to open your hand. Anything that requires any form of coordination is delayed, which has its knock-on effects, because if you can't swallow, there's certain things that you can't eat. If there's certain things that you can't eat, there's certain nutrients that you're not taking in. If there's certain issues with your gut or with whatever the case might be, there's always another thing that we were constantly putting a stop, some form of a stopgate on to try and circumnavigate. Now, 7 years in, it's a lot more stable. But to answer your question, how do I stay here? I think it's a combination of the drugs and the alcohol. It's a combination of being able to talk about it, I suppose. I've come to learn that talking about it does help. I had in the past felt that the story was so depressing that nobody else wanted to hear it. And I didn't feel like it was a good thing to share it because I didn't have any nice things to say. I wasn't sharing stories of joy or happiness. I don't have videos or photographs of pleasant moments to share. My experiences are mine. and they're difficult experiences for other people to take on board. And there was a sense of burdening others by sharing my fears or concerns. Um, and you're right, through work, I mean, it's very difficult to host a radio show and be lively every afternoon, Monday through to Friday, and drive people home, tell jokes and be frivolous with celebrity gossip news, or running a feature, or conducting a competition, or taking a phone call, and supposed to be as excited as I would normally be if this is what's going on at home.
Yeah.
There were definitely moments where I would get messages from Rue saying, Zoe's turning blue again. What do I do? And yeah,
Mid show. So you're
what do you
doing the
do?
drive show for the radio station, and then you get a message like
Yep.
that from your wife. How
Yep.
do you find the energy to fake it even?
I think my body wanted to run.
Yeah.
My body wanted to be in a car and wanted to be at home. My brain said, you're not allowed to do that. You have to stay here. You have a responsibility to your employer. So for the most part, I think my teammates could see that I had received bad news. And I feel terrible when I think back on how gingerly they probably walked around me during that time. They were very sensitive to the fact that I was brittle. I was exceptionally fragile. And yes, I faked it a lot, to the point where I felt I had two personalities, one that was operating when the microphone was on, and the other that people either couldn't see because the microphones were off, or was the personality that I had at home, because they were the same person. Which is often why people say to me, but why did you stop calling yourself Shauno, on the radio? There was a point where I was stopped referring to myself as Shauno. I was like, you're listening to Sean. And people were like, oh, I hear you stopped saying Shauno. I was like, yeah. It was a way for me to become more authentic and to try and integrate those two, for the lack of a better word, saying those two personalities to be one person. It felt like Shauno was this exuberant, enthusiastic, driven, excitable person, whereas Sean was anything but that. He was really just trying to hold it together.
Yeah.
And yeah, that was exceptionally hard. Did I answer your question?
Yes, I think you did.
Okay.
It was really look. The question I asked was about just like how did you how do you know how did you get through all of this?
Right.
So,
Oh, yes,
so it
yes,
was a
yes.
very broad
Oh,
question.
yes. Yeah.
I there's like I said there's so much more to the story than we ever have time for in one episode. But I mean, just as we close, like, just thank you for being honest about this. I know you say, like you're saying, this is your story. You're not sure how it could ever benefit other people, but it really does, because even for myself, there are still similarities in the difficulties that fathers go through in those early days. It's you. I think the way that your story is so heightened, it amplifies all of those things in such a big way. It makes it very clear to the rest of us. Oh wait, that's what I went through. I went through a version of that. I experienced this sort of feeling that isn't like I said, not as near as amplified as what you went through, but it does help us process that as well. So it's I'm very grateful to you for being willing to talk about it more. And look, like I said, Zoe is my favorite golden girl from Kales River. So for all of the things, I'm glad that she's around. And I'm sure you are too, because you're her dad. Obviously you are. So just, is there a way that you could maybe sum up the last 6 years with Zoe in 6 words? They don't have to be a sentence. It could be like 6 different words that you would maybe use to sum up the 6 years with Zoe.
Tumultuous, difficult, adventurous. Adventurous sounds like such a positive word, which is nice. There needs to be a word that sort of encapsulates everything that I have learned, because I have grown. Maybe growth is maybe a good one.
Growth, love it.
From a mental standpoint, I have grown. Development, that is a big word for me. And I have seen that in myself, in my relationship with my wife, in my child who has developed and has surpassed what doctors had prescribed for her
There we
life.
go.
Sorry.
Let it go. You go, girl.
And am I at 5
You're at
yet?
5.
I think my last word would be spirited. I'd like to see those 6 words written down because I'd like to maybe change 1 or 2 of them, but I reserve rights to be able to change 1 or 2 in a week or so's
Well,
time.
that's the lovely thing about this journey of parenting. It is continuing for both of us. So in a year's time, you get to add a 7th word.
Yay!
Hey, thank you so much for listening to this episode of Have You Asked Your Dad? We so appreciate the fact that you could get all the way to the end. It was a very emotional episode because this is a very emotional topic. So thank you so much for spending the time with us. We would love to hear your story of what it was like when your child first arrived into the family. You can send that to us via email to hyaydpod@gmail.com. That's hyatpod@gmail.com. Or you can just get hold of us on Instagram. Search for Have You Asked Your Dad? But from Sean and myself, we will chat to you again next week. Cheers for now.